if you're somebody who's been shooting video for a while, and I'm not just talking like client work and for work or filmmaking, but video in its multitude of forms, whether it be content that you want to shoot of family, of friends, of yourself, like this kind of thing, of action at the gym, for client work. If you're looking for something that's a good piece of hardware that will enable you to do all of that, then you will understand just having one camera is not the solution. You want to have at least 2, maybe even 3 cameras. One of the things that I like to do, especially when traveling, is I will pair 2 cameras together and you mount it together. So one of the things I like to do, whether it's the Sony ZV-E10 or my Canon EOS M6 Mark II, I'll have that, and then I will mount a Insta360, the Leica 1-inch version of that. So that way I have a ultra wide angle as well as my regular standard angle that I can shoot with. This being, like right now I'm shooting on a Sigma 30 millimeter f1.4, and the thing is, it's a standard in a full frame field of view or actual field of view. You're getting something similar to like a 45 mil, and I actually really like this focal length. And so but at the same time, like right over here on my Google Pixel, I'm capturing an ultra wide angle, so kind of give me that flexibility, especially when it comes to the edit. I can shoot between and choose between these 2 kind of cameras. Now, if I don't have the if I don't have my Google Pixel, I might have my Insta360, but I didn't have it with me, so that's why I chose this. But you'll recognize that anybody who's been shooting video for a little while, it's always good to have 2 cameras. Now, when it comes to putting together something a little bit more professional, you'll typically have your eyes on something like a Sony FX3. And the thing about the Sony FX3 is that not only is it a large sensor camera, a full frame camera, but it's one of those cameras that does almost everything really well. It's a camera that's been designed for filmmakers, for documentarians, as well as content creators. And it's also got a second camera that you can pair well with it, which is the Sony FX30, which is the same body, same design, but a crop sensor that's built into it. Now, why are these 2 cameras really good, and what's the limitation that you might be facing if you just get the FX3? And the limitation is this: with the FX3 as an A cam, it's excellent. In theory, having a camera that is able to that's the thing that stands out to me really well, is fast sensor readout speed. So, and this is one of the challenges that I've had to kind of work with with regards to the Sony ZV-E10, is that because of its slower sensor readout speed, and same thing with the A7C, it's got a slower sensor readout speed, meaning if you move this camera around a bit or you try to capture action, sports and stuff, you're going to get some clear jello effect, unless you run it through some sort of like catalyst browse or gyro flow. Then you might be able to reduce that rolling shutter, that jello effect. The FX3 has a really fast, probably the fastest sensor readout speed in its category, in its space, in the sense that you don't have to worry about it being jello. Whenever I'm traveling, I shy from taking the Sony camera because of the rolling shutter factor, because whenever I'm shooting, I'm totally low-key, inconspicuous, as well as casual with my shooting style. And so I need the ability to be able to, have whip pans and things like that, and for it to not kind of like jello back and forth. Canon tends to be pretty good with that. The Canon M6 Mark II, for example, is rolling shutter 17 milliseconds. And so what that really translates to is that when I put it through gyro flow, I'm not going to see any jello. And so, whereas with the Sony ZV-E10, I will. But with the FX3, that's something that's not going to be an issue. So that's one of the things that really pairs well. But one of the things I can appreciate about something like a cell phone, like the Google Pixel or even the iPhone, is that it's got 3 lenses. So you got all your bases covered. Even with the new Samsung phone, my wife got the new Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra. I think that's what it is, the one that takes the really big pictures of the moon. And so what that does is it's essentially you've got all your bases covered. So you've got your wide angle, you've got your standard focal length, and you've got your telephoto zoom. Now, for me, when it comes to travels, when you're kind of carrying a camera, you have to, there's going to be a compromise in which you'll be letting go of one of these three things. Now, in an ideal world, you would have three cameras, but who's got three arms and three hands to be able to carry all that? And so what typically has happened with me is that I would have my Insta360 as a wide angle. I'd have my Sony or my Canon as my standard angle, usually between a 30 to 40 millimeter focal length. And then I'll have my cell phone with its telephoto to get the tight angles. But the problem is that when you're trying to mix the footage together, I can make the Insta360 work with the Canon or the Sony, but matching the cell phone to that tends to be a little bit more challenging. And so one of the things that I was thinking to myself, one of the best pairings that I ever did was when I took two ZV-E10s, I put an 85 millimeter on one, and I had a 14 to 20 millimeter on the other. So I had a wide to, like an ultra wide to wide angle zoom that I kind of carried with me. Not kind of, I actually carried with me. And I used this on my bike ride. Now, throughout the bike ride, when it came to being in transit, I was using that 14 to 20. But when I was on the ride, whenever we'd make our stops, I was using my 85 mil a lot more because it allowed me to capture a lot more detail. Now, when I go on family trips, I have my Insta, I have my my Canon or my Sony, usually at 40 to 45 millimeters in terms of actual field of view, and I'll pack something like a telephoto lens in my bag. But because it's not mounted, it's one of those things where when the shot comes up, I'm more apt to take my cell phone and capture that. So one of the perks of having a camera like the ZV-E10 or a Sony A7C, or even as I would think in theory, the A7 IV, is that all of these cameras, well, the ZV-E10 is already a crop camera, and you can crop in further with the active stabilization turned on. It crops in 1.4x, and with the clear image zoom, that's an additional 1.5x. The A7C has something similar where you can go into crop mode as if you have a ZV-E10. And then in addition to that, you can get you can do another 1.5x crop, and you're still within the 4K resolution. The challenge with an FX3, for example, is that the FX3 is not a high resolution sensor, relatively speaking. So the ZV-E10 is 24 megapixels, A7C is about 24 or so megapixels, A7 IV is like 30 some megapixels, and so you're dealing with anywhere between 6 or 7K of resolution. You can always either oversample that down to 4K, or you can punch into that sensor and still get 4K. The reason the Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra, that you're getting that really super ultra zoom of the moon, the reason it's able to do that, it's got an 8K sensor in the camera, albeit it's a very small sensor, it's still an 8K sensor. So when you're doing the zoom, you're zooming in at like anywhere between 1080 or 4K. And so you're doing the optical zoom, and on top of the optical zoom, you're doing a digital zoom, but you're still getting 1080p or 4K quality because you're still within the domain of that sensor. You might oversample, or you might not go oversample, you might do 1-to-1, but it still looks good in terms of quality. You can't do that on the FX3. And the reason is that because you're dealing with a 12 megapixel sensor. Now, 4K, when it comes to viewing, is closer to 8 megapixels. So on the FX3, you're taking a 4K, you're taking a 12 megapixel and you're downsampling it to 4K essentially. And I think 12 megapixels is something closer to like 4.3 or 4.5K. And so now one of the things that having that little bit of flexibility is when you turn on something like active stabilization, you do get a little bit of a crop, but it's not that much. It's like a 1.1 inch, a 1.1x crop. But if you want to punch in like you would on a crop sensor or like you would on an A7C or A7 IV, what you need to do is you can go into crop mode. However, on the FX3 or the A7S III, then when you go into crop mode, you're not getting 4K resolution anymore. And so now you can cheat 4K where you do a clear image zoom, but even then it's still cropping into the sensor and it is now up-resing that 1080p image to 4K. So if you want to get a tighter image, it's usually helpful to pair your FX3 with like an FX30, because it's a crop sensor, you can now take that same lens, whatever lens that you're using, whether it's a standard focal length, like a 28-70, or 35-150, or a 20-40. That's a lens I actually have my eyes on, the Tamron 20-40. If you take that same lens and you put it on the FX30, now suddenly you got a 1.5x increase crop. And on top of that, you can punch in, again, with clear image zoom and active stabilization, getting closer to like a 3x crop if you desire. And so suddenly a 70 millimeter becomes like a 200 millimeter. And so you don't really need to carry extra long focal length lenses when you're traveling, when you have these two cameras, an FX3 and FX30. What I'm looking forward to is that coming end of this month with the seeming release of the ZV-E1, which is rumored to have the FX3 sensor in it, but without a lot of the bells and whistles, that's the assumption, then it would also be a question of now, what would that camera pair well with? Because on the crop sensor size, the thing that I wish the Sony ZV-E10 did better is simply the rolling shutter, right? It's bad enough for me to reach for my Canon over my Sony when it comes to trips, especially capturing footage in transit. And so, but one of the things I always miss with the Sony when compared to the Canon is that the dynamic range, the image that I get out of the Sony is far superior when compared to something like the Canon. So that's usually the trade-off. But anyway, this is one of the reasons why I believe it's important to have two cameras in your system. And it's always good to have these two cameras paired together. So for example, on the Canon side, you have the R7 and the R6 Mark II, for example, or you have an R10 and an R8. These two cameras, one crop sensor, one full frame. Or in the case of Sony, having a ZV-E10 and A7C, or an FX3 and an FX30. The thing that I'm really looking forward to is not so much the ZV-E1, but what's going to be the crop sensor pairing for the ZV-E1, not the ZV-E10. In fact, if they come out with the ZV-E10 Mark II, which takes the sensor of the Sony FX30 and, takes out a lot of the bells and whistles and makes it more consumable, then that's something to kind of think about. But yeah, this is just more or less me kind of thinking out loud, and also sharing and expressing the importance of being, whatever you're shooting and wherever you're shooting, shooting with more than one camera. In an ideal scenario, in transit, being able to capture something that's generally wide to standard, and then something that's from standard to telephoto. If you got those two more or less spaces covered, or three, depending on how you like to shoot, then I think you're in a good place. It allows you to capture everything, get coverage of shots, and tell a better story ultimately. But what are your thoughts? Do you like to shoot multi-angle? Do you have multiple cameras that you typically shoot with, or do you just stick to one and you try to capture coverage, as they call it, and then kind of cut that all together? Or are you kind of like OT, or as one of my buddies try to call it, are you Mr. One Take or Miss One Take? Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts on not only the upcoming cameras, but in terms of your shooting style?